Hello, everybody. Thank you for waiting and being patient with us. We're going to start the webinar in just another minute here and give some more time for everyone to join. All right, so it looks like we can get started here. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar today on study tips and test preparation for operator certification. My name is Maya Bani from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin here, we're just going to go over a few housekeeping items and then we can get started. During the training today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be answering questions throughout and saving some for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This session has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now, just for a little bit about us, the Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I'll be sharing shortly in the chat. On that note, we can get started, and I would like to introduce our presenter for today, James Markham, a research engineer for the Southwest Environmental Finance Center.
All right, thanks, Maya. Let's get the screen switched here. Alrighty. All right, looks like we're good to go. If you can just confirm that.
Yep, you're all set to go.
All right, so thanks everybody for joining us. I'm gonna try to keep today kind of short and to the point. This is really meant to serve as an introduction to this particular webinar series about operator certification. Today's session, obviously test tips and study tips. And then the later sessions are going to focus more on the actual wastewater treatment topics. The info I'm going to go over today is pretty much universally applicable. As I said, it's primarily about test study and preparation techniques. But as we're going through the series, you know, recognizing that you guys are from across the country, from a lot of different jurisdictions. Sometimes there's going to be situations where the specific details might vary a little bit for your particular state. I'm going to talk about some of those in the context of study guides and things like that today. But in general, our focus here is to kind of focus on things that are applicable across the board, no matter where you are. I want to run a quick poll here just to get an idea about who I'm talking to, the audience. So Maya, if you could run that first poll for us.
Absolutely. It is out, and the question is, are you currently a certified wastewater operator? And the options are yes, no, or not yet, but I plan to be soon. All right, I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, and 1. The results are 36% said yes, they are, 29% said no, and 34% said not yet, but I plan to be soon.
Well, awesome. For those of you in the yes category, most of this will probably be review, but for those of you who are in the plan to be soon, hopefully you'll get something useful out of this. So let's start by talking about study tips. It's hard to pass an exam that you haven't studied for. First tip is basically don't panic. Even if you've never taken the wastewater OpCert test before, or if you have and didn't pass, step one is to not panic, because the test is one that covers knowledge that you use or could use on the job. And of course, that's going to cover a broad range of wastewater treatment topics at different levels, depending on which one you're taking. And not all of that knowledge might be used in your particular day-to-day operations. For example, you might have a lagoon system, and for the test, at least, you're going to have to know a little bit about how conventional treatment systems work. But fundamentally, the exam is about testing tasks that you could do or are doing in your day-to-day job duties. So this is one of those exams where you really can leverage your day-to-day work experience to help you pass the exam. In most jurisdictions, you have to have been working for a plant for our system for at least a year before you can even take the test, although there are some variations on that. And because of that, before you actually get to exam day, you're going to have spent a fair amount of time doing the job you're going to be tested on. So that's the first thing to recognize, is that although there are some topics that you're going to be covered that you maybe are not as familiar with, much of what shows up on the exam is stuff that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that's things like your regular duties: inspecting equipment, monitoring conditions, doing sampling, recording meter data and things like that, reporting test results to various agencies. So it's a good idea, particularly if you've just started in the industry, as you're learning how to do your job, to sort of think in terms of how could the things I'm doing be put on a test. Because really, what's the difference between an operator and a certified operator? Certified operator has taken and passed the exam. There are a lot of systems out there that are being run by folks who haven't passed the exam yet, doing similar jobs. It's just that once you've passed that exam, you're certified to do the job. So why study? It's something that most of us, me included, don't really like to do. I think the main reason for studying is to find out where those gaps in knowledge are. Again, the OpCert exams cover a broad range of treatment techniques, many of which you may not deal with on a day-to-day basis. And a good way to figure out what you know and what you don't know is through developing a study plan. And we'll give you some tips on ways of doing that as we go through. But fundamentally, doing studying, doing practice exams is all about finding out what you know and what you don't know. So why am I showing you a picture of a basketball here? I like metaphors, and I kind of think of the OpsCert test as kind of like big game day. So if you follow that analogy a little bit here, studying is like practice. You go to the gym and try to develop the skills that you need for the game, your free throws, hook shots, whatever. Going through manuals, doing old problems, doing old tests is effectively the wastewater analogy to basketball practice. You do it, study a lot of different ways under different conditions, and work hard at what you're not good at to get better. And the reason you do that has been shown time and time again, lots of different studies, that people with better study methods and strategies tend to score higher on exams. So if you took the exam and the outcome wasn't the way you liked, or if maybe you're just somebody who has test anxiety, that's something I deal with, then having an effective study program can really help alleviate a lot of that. I think of sample tests in the context of study kind of like the pickup games, right? It's not the big game, state championship's not on the line, but it's real game conditions. You're out there playing with other players. It shows you what you're good at, and again, what still needs work. If you constantly get stripped, you need to work on your ball handling. So those pickup games, or sample tests, excuse me, are like the pickup games, and it's a really good idea to take them because test conditions and study conditions are very different. Test the areas that you have trouble with, because again, those are going to point out where you have gaps in practical knowledge, and then you use that information to round out your skill set. And by that, I mean, the areas that you don't do well in on the test, again, might be areas that you don't have a lot of practical experience with, and it gives you a direction to follow when developing your study plan, test plan, and quite frankly, your career. And then obviously, the OpsCert test itself is game day. You wouldn't expect to win an important game without ever practicing, at least not realistically. And again, if your test outcome when you take your next exam, or if you took one before, isn't the way you wanted, changing how you study can have a really big impact on how you do the next time around. So let's talk about some study tips, or put another way, like how do you run good practice leading up to that game. And step one is make a study plan. Most coaches show up with plays that are going to run, or and plan for getting from point A to point B. This is all about self-assessment, understanding realistically where you are, where you need to be, and building a plan around that, and expecting that to change over time as you get more comfortable with different topics. As I said, if you can consistently make that hook shot, you probably don't have to focus on that quite as hard. You still have to practice it because you don't want it to get rusty, but not at the same level as something that you maybe aren't that good at. So what are we talking about here? Time management. It's really important to set aside a reasonable amount of time for study so that you aren't trying to cram everything in the last minute. There's a lot of material that has to be covered, and you don't want to be trying to learn it all the night before the exam. I can tell you from personal experience that doesn't work out very well. Start studying early, well before the exam date. If exam's on the 30th, you don't want to start studying on the 29th. This is really just, again, another way of saying manage your time, which is what we started this sequence with. Think about where you are, where you need to be on test day, and reevaluate periodically through the use of sample exams and some of the other techniques that we're going to talk about here. Look and see whether you're on track to pass the test when you have planned to take it. And there's a calendar month on this slide here. I don't mean to imply that you should be able to study for and pass this exam in 30 days. Maybe if you spent all 30 days doing nothing but my point here is really just to make a plan with a focus and have some points along the way where you are sort of stopping and evaluating. Really important to nail down the fundamentals. The nice thing about the OpsCert exam is you don't have to get 100% right. Typically, it's 70% is a passing grade in most states. So you don't have to have a perfect game. You just have to have a good one. And again, this is all about building on your practical knowledge. As we will talk about a little bit, as we dig into this, you have day-to-day operations, you have operations that happen in your facility that maybe you're not directly involved with, but could observe and ask questions about. And then there are a variety of study guides and materials that can really be of use to you to help you work harder on those weak spots. You know, it's great if you can always hit that free throw, but if that's the only shot you got, you're not that useful to the team. And speaking of the team, you know, your coworkers are really good resources for you, particularly the people who've gone through the testing experience before, who are maybe at higher levels of certification than you currently are, but want to get to. You know, ask questions, learn on the job. I find that if I can explain a process to somebody, that means I generally understand it. If I can't explain it rationally, that means I don't. So, you know, as you're doing things in your job, having conversations about what you're doing, why you're doing it the way you do it, why it's not done a certain different way, can be really useful in that sort of just getting that basic fundamental knowledge in your head about the things you do, so that you can, you know, again, have a strong base upon which to build and fill in on those areas that you don't necessarily have as much experience with. Training materials and handouts and manuals are going to be key to getting through this. There are a lot of study guides and materials out there. I'm going to point out a few useful ones, but your state may have its own set of guides. One of the sort of fundamental text that's used in a lot of places is the wastewater treatment guides from Sacramento State University. It costs about $100. There's also a 2-volume set on wastewater treatment plant management. Maya, if you wouldn't mind tossing the link in there, I'm going to throw a link to these guides and the online courses that go with it that Sacramento State does that might be of use to you as a way of studying. Individual states also have training courses. It varies from state to state. Some different non-state entities will also provide courses like the ones that we're doing right now. So there's a lot of different resources out there, but a lot of the exams are built on these sort of fundamental texts like the one we're looking at here. As I said, your state may have a specific manual. We're here in New Mexico. Our state used to have a manual that they developed that was devoted specifically toward helping folks pass the state exam. This one isn't currently available on the website anymore, but there are copies of it floating around. And this is, again, one of those things where it's really useful to sort of hit up your coworkers. You know, folks that have gone through this process before may have study materials. The state may have study materials that are available. Your local library may have study materials that are available. Local community colleges, things like that, places where they have, you know, treatment programs in place. I want to point out that this grant funding that is providing the money for this particular training series has also provided some money for putting copies of the Sac State books in local libraries. Obviously, we can't hit every library in the country, but we've been able to provide these study guides to some lending libraries around the country. If your system maybe doesn't have a copy of this, or you find that you've looked around and you don't find that you have access to a copy of it, reach out to us. We might be able to place a copy in a local lending library near you that you would be able to check out and use for study, and then that future operators in your area would also potentially be able to use as well. These things might also be guides that it would be useful for your system to purchase, to have as a resource for current and future employees. So there's a lot of different ways to get your hands on this kind of information. It's a really good idea to look and see what's available. A good place to start is your state website. You know, most states have some information about the OPCERT process available on their website, and they will typically point you toward resources that your state agency has determined are going to be useful for you as a test taker. This happens to be from my home state of Washington, and you can see the first thing that they've got listed is Cal State University. That's the link that we just threw up there, and those guides that we were referring to. They've also got, you know, resources from ABC, need to know criteria, conversion tables that you can download to use in your study, TPO magazine, AWWA resources, things like that. If your state doesn't happen to have a particularly broad list of resources, you can reach out to us. We can help you find some, or you can look at states around you and see what they do. Because again, wastewater treatment is wastewater treatment. Generally, the information that's available from a nearby state will be of use to you, although there are going to be some state-specific, perhaps reporting differences and things like that that you have to be concerned with. There will also be other manuals. For example, in Washington State, they've got this thing called the Red Book, which is sort of a summary of basic information for treatment plant operators. It's available free on the website. It's something you can get and can download. NMED here in New Mexico has a list of need to knows, which basically lays out what kind of information you need to know at different certification levels, about cross connections and collection systems and treatment ponds and sampling and state and federal regulations. So if you can get a hold of your state's need to know list, if your state has one, and look at this and realize, I don't really know anything about cross connections, you've just identified a weak point to focus on. Similarly, Water Professionals International, which used to be ABC, provides state exams for a lot of states out there. So things are getting computerized now. It used to be every state had their own paper test. Now there's a lot of computerized testing going on through individual points like this. So there's probably 24 states, maybe more, that use the WPI tests. And on their website, they've got some information about what the breakout is in terms of topics and question percentages on each of the levels. And you can see that, it's pretty consistent for security, safety, and administration. But like lab analysis on the lower level exams is a small part, becomes a bigger part of the level 4. Same thing goes with treatment processes. Becomes a little bit more important the higher level you go up. So this also gives you an idea of how much you're going to have to know about each individual topic. Because if you spent all of your time focusing on lab analysis and ignored the treatment processes, you might get 100% on the lab analysis piece, but that's obviously not going to help you pass the exam, because you need to be able to hit most of these. That being said, if I was looking at this and was trying to figure out where I could maybe scrimp, well, even if I knew nothing about lab analysis, chances are if I could get most of the other questions right, I could probably still pass the exam. Obviously, that's not an approach you want to take. It's best to try and cover all of your bases. But if you're finding yourself in a pinch, you can use tools like this to sort of help you decide where you want to focus your efforts. The state study guides are also really, really important. Typically, when you're taking these exams on the computer, or if your state still happens to do a paper version, you'll be given something like this. This happens to be New Mexico's printout, but it has the basic formulas and conversion factors and things that you need for the exam, which also gives you an idea of the kinds of questions that you're going to be asked. Chances are there's going to be detention time questions on there. It's a really good idea to have a working knowledge of these kinds of resources, particularly the ones that you're liable to be have access to during the exam, so that you can quickly find what you need. Taking really good notes and studying for reference, and studying as you're doing your reference study, is really, really useful. And this, I think, is primarily about sort of close reading of the materials that you're given. It's really easy to sort of read through things and get sort of stumped by it or overwhelmed by it. But if you break things down into reasonable sized chunks, it's a lot easier to ingest. And what I'm talking about here is, for example, reviewing a paragraph for facts and figures and things in there that could potentially be asked in an exam situation. So this is a blurb about pipe size, talks about how sewer lines should be large enough to allow the use of cleaning equipment, talks about their size, the airspace above it. And as you read through this, you can realize that, some of these statements could very easily be turned into questions. So for example, when sized properly, a sewer line should flow half full during average daily flows. You could turn that into a question, which would be something like, how full should a sewer line flow if it's sized properly? And the answer is half full during daily flows. Every one of these sentences in here can be flipped around like that. Same thing with this statement about the airspace. What does it do? It helps maintain aerobic conditions and provides for errors in design flow. And then we've got, some information about sewer line size as well. Using this approach is really useful because it's really useful for building flashcards. Not everybody uses flashcards. They're not useful for everyone, but they can be your best friend for memorizing stuff and verifying that you actually know something and can pull it back quickly. And it's a great way to have you test yourself or have someone test you. You know, the person testing you doesn't even have to know the topic, anything about the topic they're asking you about, as long as they can read the questions for you. If you're using flashcards, a couple things to think about. Do not do your flashcards in the same order every time. Mix them up so that you're getting effectively random questions. And as you go through and figure out whether you know something or not, I always end up with two piles at the end of any flashcard session. One where I got them right and one where I got them wrong. And as I find that certain questions are consistently ending up in the right column, I will test myself less and less on those and focus on the things that I don't know. It's, again, a way of assessing what you know comfortably, what you don't know, and setting yourself up to sort of shift that focus so that you're focusing in on filling in the gaps. The good thing about flashcards is you can also loan them to your buddies or coworkers and make the process easier for staff that's coming up behind you. And you know, the people ahead of you in the process might have study tools as well. One of the folks that's going to be working on this series, AJ Barney, you'll meet him in future sessions. He's a level 4 wastewater operator, and he uses flashcards, and he still has his flashcards, and he was able to make those available to, you know, former coworkers that were doing the test. So, you know, those are useful tools. And the other thing is that, you know, you start out at level 1, you may want to eventually get to level 4. You're still responsible for knowing all that lower level level 1 information. So that's a good sort of reference piece to have and a good way to sort of refresh your knowledge about the sort of day-to-day lower level operations that might not be in your area of responsibility anymore, but you're still going to be responsible for on the exam. Drawing sketches as you're doing your studying is really useful. I'm really visual. I'm a terrible artist, as you can see from my chicken scratch drawings there. But drawing things out really helps me evaluate questions. You know, what I have, what the variables are that I don't have, or, you know, and what I'm trying to actually get to. You know, when you're studying to be an engineer, they make you draw diagrams of every homework problem because it's a way of helping you visualize and understand what's going on. I do the same thing with processes. You know, thing A leads to thing B leads to thing C. It's a good way to sort of an additional way to lay out information. And quite often, I even talk to myself when I'm doing studying because I find that you know, hearing things and reading them, or hearing things and drawing them, helps reinforce the information. I'm getting the same information multiple different ways, and it just makes it more easy for me to recall. So, you know, think about your own experience. What kinds of activities work for you to get the knowledge into your head and to get it to stick, and do those. And you know, if you've never used flashcards before, try it. If they work for you, great. If they don't, do something else. There's a lot of material that you have to cover. So one question we often get is, you know, do I have to memorize all of this? And the answer to that is really no, you don't. You know, you're going to be given formula sheets during the exam. Some of this stuff you will probably have inadvertently memorized because it's stuff that you do day to day. So it's, you know, it's less of a rote memorization kind of thing. But there are some things that you can and maybe should memorize, both for the test and for work. You know, formulas that you use all the time, or processes that you use all the time. What you don't want to memorize is that, for example, you know, there was a volume question on my sample test, and the answer was in millions of gallons. So I'm looking at an exam question and there's an answer that says mg, I'm going to pick that. You want to memorize the processes, not the individual answers. You know, you might have to memorize material in areas that you're not really that familiar with, obviously, but there's a lot of processes that you're going to have to know and don't use on a daily basis. But again, the whole point is getting an understanding of the process and what's actually happening, as opposed to, you know, memorizing a specific question. That being said, if you know a formula off the top of your head, you don't have to look it up. If you can remember that there are 7.481 gallons in a cubic foot in the exam, that's one less thing you have to look up, which can save you time, going back and forth looking at reference materials. Again, you have to find a balance that works for you. But if you're going to memorize things, I would focus on the things that are actually going to be useful to you in your day-to-day job, and knowing where things are in your reference materials is often as good as knowing them off the top of your head, because if you can get to the reference material quickly and find what you're looking for, you're in a really good position. I talked about flashcards and having somebody test you. I think that testing yourself or having someone test you under realistic test conditions can be really, really beneficial. And I'll tell you a story from my own personal experience. I had to retake differential equations when I was in college. I walked into the final exam with a B+ and I walked out with an F because I bombed the final. And the reason was I hadn't been taking practice tests, even though they were made available to me in realistic conditions. I could solve most of the homework problems, but I couldn't solve them fast enough to get through the exam in a reasonable amount of time. And because of that, I panicked. Obviously, the second time I went through differential equations, I focused on doing exams, sample exams, and doing homework questions in a fast manner, so that, essentially under test conditions, so that I would be familiar with those. I think studying with a partner can be helpful. It can also be a hindrance if you end up spending most of your time talking about something other than what you're doing, but it can be really useful for accountability. I talked about at the very beginning the idea of setting up a study program and devoting specific amounts of time to actual test prep. And that's great in practice, but real life often gets in the way. We've got families, we've got kids, we get called out for emergencies, things happen. Having a study partner can really help with accountability. Maybe you decide, we're going to meet for 2 hours on Saturday at the library, and even if you're looking at different things or studying different sections, just knowing that you have to be there, that somebody's going to hold you accountable, can really be useful. It helps you use the time that you've set aside and not get distracted and think, oh, well, I'll skip this week and I'll get to next week, because chances are something's going to come up next week as well. So quick and dirty overview of things to think about during your study portion of the OPCERT testing procedure. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, the test tips, like what you're going to do on game day. And you're going to find that there is a significant amount of overlap with concepts that we talked about here on the study side thing. It's really important to understand the testing format, particularly since a lot of states, maybe even most now, are using computer-based testing, and that may be a format that you're not really familiar with, particularly if you've never taken it before. Computer-based testing is one thing, and then you've got this specific test as well. It's also not cheap. It's $30 a pop to take these kinds of exams. So to the extent that some states have sample exams that you can look at, there are online study programs that involve sample tests that you can use. To the extent that you can get access to those are really useful because they help you understand the format. Another part of your strategy might be to schedule a test exam for yourself, assuming that it's financially feasible, where you're not so worried about passing the exam. It's more about sort of getting yourself comfortable with the interface. Obviously, I would not do that at the beginning of my study period. I would do that near the end, but sometimes just taking the need to pass off, taking that one variable away can help relax you a little bit. And you might find that, while you're taking your sample exam to get familiar with the interface, you actually pass the thing, in which case you're in a great position. So you can kind of think of that as a preseason game. Might not be something that is possible, but something to think about, whether particularly if you've never taken an online exam before or a computerized exam, because the format can be intimidating. I had a friend who failed his FE exam, that's the intro engineering exam, because he was used to doing it on paper, and when he got to the test center, he had to do it on a computer, and it just flustered him, and he ended up having to retake it. So something to think about. pointed out in the earlier section that there are a lot of reference guides available for you. Typically, there's going to be a reference guide available for you during the test, and a lot of states will give you access to copies of that before. So, for example, in New Mexico, the one I showed you before, that's available online. Tells you exactly what sort of conversion factors and formulas they're going to be available. As I said before, sometimes you want to memorize the actual formula. Otherwise, other times it's just good enough to know, where in the reference guide that is. So if I'm doing conversions of volumes, well, that's in the volume section. I know that that's on page 1 of the guide or page 4. Again, it's all about sort of speeding up the time it takes to get through these materials. Monitor your time during the test as well. We talked about monitoring study time and making sure that you had enough of it. Recognize that you've got a finite amount of time during the test. So, wear a watch or keep an eye on the test timer. A lot of times the online versions will have a countdown clock that lets you know where you're at. Make sure you understand exactly how much time you have to do the test and how many questions there are. So this is a New Mexico example. Currently, I believe the New Mexico exam is 4 hours long. You got 100 questions. You got to get 70 of them right. So gives you a little under 2.5 minutes per question, which is not a lot of time. Even if you only answered 7, that's about 3.5 minutes, or excuse me, 70 of the questions, assuming you're going to get them all right. That's 3.5 minutes max. If you're taking the NMED test, the ITC test is only 3 hours, so you've got even less time. My point here is not to panic, but that you've got a finite amount of time. Understand that the questions are designed to be answered quickly. Some are designed to be answered very, very fast. Others are going to be more complicated. And even though the calculations are typically pretty straightforward, the answers are sometimes designed to trip you up. Sometimes you're going to run into a question that really stumps you. My point here is don't waste all of your time answering questions you don't know the answers to or trying to answer them. If you get to something that stumps you, circle it, move on and get back to it later, because you might be able to pass the exam just fine without even answering that question or attempting to answer it. You don't want to kill critical time focusing on something where you're essentially just guessing. So the idea is, go through the exam, answer the questions that you know first, and then go back to the ones that you're having trouble with, and then see if you can eliminate some answers and give yourself a reasonable chance of getting that question right. We'll talk a little bit about some strategies that you can use to do that here in just a second. Another thing to think about is, not fighting the premise. And by that, I mean, don't try to outthink the test. Answer the question that they asked, not the question that you think it should be. This is something that I have run into as well, where I read a question on an exam and I'm not sure what's going on here, and I think they're asking one thing, and I realize I've answered the wrong question. So it's a good idea to not even look at the answers first. Just read through the question and make sure that you understand what you're being asked, and then go from there. Also recognize that sometimes the exact answer is not going to be on the test. There's issues with rounding in math. Sometimes there'll be an answer that's really, really close, but doesn't exactly match what came out on your calculator. Typically, it's the closest answer there. If there's nothing even remotely close to your calculator, maybe you skip the question and come back or run your calculation again. But recognize that sometimes you're going to pick the best available answer that's there. Funny answers are usually wrong. We talked about using strategies to eliminate obviously wrong answers, and ones that make you crack up probably aren't going to be right. They might be, but they're not. And by way of example, what I'm talking about here, so this is a sample question that we've kind of played with a little bit. But if the question is the best way for a manager to transmit information that's important to all employees is, and the option is, one of the options is tell your mom, that's probably not correct. I mean, in my mom's case, it probably would be because she was the town gossip. But in most cases, something like that, you could probably just cross off. And then you can logic your way through these things. And, when I was talking about earlier, sometimes running into questions where you're really not sure of the answer, or it's outside your basic day-to-day experience, quite often you can use common sense and sort of general understandings about the world that we live in to logic your way through this and at least eliminate some of the wrong answers and give yourself a better chance of getting it right, even if you have to guess among the remaining answers. So in this case, tell your mom's obviously right off the list, but we've got some other options here that sound pretty reasonable. Sending a memorandum, having a face-to-face meeting, putting a notice on the plant's website. And again, all of these might be ways of getting that information, but again, don't fight the question. The question here is asking for what's the best way of the answers that they've given you. Me looking at this, I would think sort of logic my way through this sort of like this, like, well, memorandum are great. Where do memorandums usually end up? Maybe on a notice board or in somebody's mailbox. Are people likely going to see that in a timely manner? Probably not. So I might be able to cross that one off. The last one, they're putting a notice on the plant's website. Well, who looks at the plant's website? And chances are that's probably going to be the public more than internal staff. So maybe that's not so good either. I definitely know that if somebody has a face-to-face meeting with me, they're going to transmit that information. So of the available answers we have here, that's probably the thing I'm going to go with. And again, this is something that you could just basically work your way through and effectively eliminate answers with your knowledge and common sense. Another, more realistic example, and this is an actual exam question. I believe this is from the New Mexico State exam, but chlorine cylinder is thought to be leaking. If an aqueous ammonia vapor is passed over the valve in the presence of a leak, would cause what? So what's going to happen here? And again, I pointed out before that I like to look at the question and make sure I understand it first, which is why I'm not showing you any of the answers here. Most of you probably, or at least the folks that are already certified, probably know the answer to this question. But what are they asking here? They're talking about a chlorine cylinder that's leaking. What do I know about chlorine? Well, it's a disinfectant, sure, but it's also poisonous. It's used in trench warfare during World War II or I to kill people. It's a dangerous substance. We have to use PPE around it. It's not something you want to be messing with. So with that sort of basic understanding of what I'm talking about here, and quite frankly, ammonia is not good for you either. I can move on to the answers, which in this case are a loud noise, an odor of hydrogen sulfide, red smoke, or white smoke. So even not really knowing too much about it, but just from operational experience, if I know that chlorine is a poison and we're dealing with a leak here and trying to do some testing, the idea that I'm going to do something that's going to cause a loud noise, also maybe referred to as an explosion, seems kind of odd. So probably would be able to cross that off. Same thing with the next one, an odor of hydrogen sulfide, the idea that I'm going to be working around chlorine and or ammonia without PPE, which is what you'd have to, the situation you'd have to be in order to smell it, is again, something you can probably cross off the list, the idea that somebody's going to want you to smell poisonous chlorine, which leaves me with two options, red smoke and white smoke. And even if you have no idea what the answer is, just using common sense, you've eliminated half of the choices and made gotten yourself to a 50-50 choice. Correct answer happens to be white smoke. But again, even if you didn't do that, just by eliminating the obviously wrong answers, you've given yourself a 50-50 chance of getting that question right. So same thing, another example, which of the following is a disease that could be caused by exposure to wastewater? So again, what am I talking about? I'm talking about diseases and wastewater exposure. In this case, I've got four options: HIV, chickenpox, cholera, and pneumonia. Most of you are probably zeroing it right in on the correct answer. But again, if you sort of logic your way through this based on sort of general knowledge, you could probably get to the right standpoint. What do we know about HIV? It's generally a bloodborne disease. So we can probably cross that off. Chickenpox, hardly anybody even gets chickenpox anymore. And folks that did, typically that was kids, and we get it from touching each other. That's assuming they're not vaccinated. So chickenpox, probably not a concern either. Leaves us with cholera and pneumonia. Pneumonia could be bacterial. So I guess theoretically, if you ingested wastewater or inhaled wastewater, you might be able to get pneumonia. But if you know anything about sort of wastewater treatment and water treatment in general, One of the things that they did was stopped a lot of people dying from waterborne diseases, one of the biggest of which is cholera. So again, just by kind of using basic understandings about the world around us and what you know about the job that you do, you could work your way to the correct answer. There are also a lot of not questions that you could potentially reframe, and by that I mean a question like this, which says, which of the following is not a measure of volume? One way to, if you're having trouble figuring out what the answer is, one way to reframe that is to take the not out and go, okay, well, which of these is a measure of volume? And work your way from there. Talked earlier about understanding your reference sheets. You could answer this question just by looking at the reference sheet. So under the volume section, I've got cubic feet and gallons as being interchangeable. I've got, so I can knock those two off. I've got gallons and cubic meters as interchangeable. I can knock that off. When in doubt, the obvious answer here, or the only thing that's not volume, is square inches. So obviously you have to frame the question back the way it was originally formatted. It wasn't asking you which ones were, but which ones weren't. But by doing that process of elimination, you can figure that out. Again, visuals are really helpful. You could do the same question pretty easily just by drawing a sketch. What do you know about volume? Like a simple thing that you could figure out the volume of would be a rectangle. It's got length, it's got width, it's got height. I know that means I've got some sort of units that are cubed, right? So that knocks two of these out. Gallons, I know that's volume. That's what my milk comes in, or water, which again leaves me with the square inches as the leftover. So there's a lot of different ways you can get to the same point, depending on how you think and what works for you. But being able to draw sketches, being able to use that sort of common knowledge is really, really, really useful. So that's some sort of quick and dirty discussion about study plans in general. The idea of having a study plan, I think, is really, really critical. You basically have to assess where you are and where you're going. Time management is going to be really key, both for the exam and for the study itself. You really want to make sure that you set aside study time and actually use it. That might be something that you can work out with your employer, where some of that maybe happens on the job, maybe not. And it all really kind of depends. But if you don't ask, you don't receive. A lot of training materials and manuals are out there. Make use of them, particularly the ones that your particular state indicates to you are useful. They're not in the business of trying to get folks to fail the exam. So if there's a reference guide or resource available on your state's website, it's probably going to be useful and be worth looking at. And again, do that close reading of your study materials as you're going through them to make sure that you're actually absorbing information and not spending an hour reading and walking away and thinking, what did I just look at? All about taking good notes, whether you're in training or you're in a study session. The idea is having reference material that you can go back to and sort of distilling the large book into a shorter set of notes into maybe a smaller set of flashcards that you can use to verify that the critical info is in your head. And again, draw sketches if those help. If you're a visual kind of person, they can often be useful. I often find that by drawing something out, I can figure out which piece is missing and what the question's actually asking for. And really, really critical, test yourself. And there's a lot of different ways you can test yourself. Flashcards are a way of testing yourself. Getting a hold of a sample exam is a way of testing yourself. Doing an online course that actually has formal tests is a way of testing yourself. Do those so that you understand what you're good at and what you're not at, with the goal of hitting that magic number and passing, because that's the thing about this. You just have to get a passing grade. Nobody cares if you got an A+ or a B- or a C. As long as you pass the exam, you're good. And that's the goal here, passing the exam and understanding what you do on a day-to-day basis so that you can do your job, correctly, efficiently, and keep your community safe. Focus on those weak points. Memorize things that you need to memorize. Again, processes are very good. You know, understanding how things work in your Pacific system are really useful, so that when you get to those questions that maybe stump you, you can sort of step back and look at you know, what you do, and you know, how does your clarifier work at your particular facility? You know, what goes in what order? What do each of those pieces do? If you understand those in your job context, you'll understand them in the test context. And you know, study with a partner if it helps. Again, some folks do much better on their own, but you know, camaraderie can help. And again, as I said, sometimes explaining something to somebody else and making sure that what you're saying makes sense is a good way to evaluate whether you actually understand something. And last but not least, start studying really early, you know, well before the test date. You know, if you just started a job as a wastewater operator and you maybe aren't going to even be eligible to take the exam for another 11 months, doesn't hurt to start studying now, you know, categorizing things you're learning on the job. There's no harm in getting ahead of the game, so that once you get to that point, you can get that certification and you know, move on to the next step of your career. I want to talk a little bit about not taking exams as well, by which I mean the idea of reciprocity. If you're already certified in a jurisdiction and you move to a different state, there is a possibility that you might actually be able to get certified in that other state without taking the exam. So using my home state of Washington as an example, they have full reciprocity agreements with Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Georgia, Guam, Hawaii, Idaho, ITCA, Wyoming, Ohio, and Massachusetts. And basically what that means is, you know, if you are certified as a level 1 or level 2 or level 3 or level 4 operator, whatever, for example, in Guam, and you move to Washington, you can essentially apply to and get certified in the state of Washington at the level that you're currently at without actually having to test. So if you're in one of those situations where you've recently moved, or maybe you have a valid current certification and you're thinking of moving, this might be something to look into, see which states have reciprocity with you, to maybe be able to avoid the exam altogether. There's also a thing called conditional reciprocity in Washington State, for example. If you've passed the exam in any of those top lists, you're basically automatically in. All you have to do is some paperwork and pay some fees. With some other states like Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, Utah, and New York, you have to have gotten a certain exam grade on their exam. So that's the one case where, you know, getting higher than a 70 might be required. But again, any state will have information about reciprocity if they have it available to you, either on the website or from the office if you call somebody. So you can figure that out. So a lot of information, short period of time, just to see if y'all were paying attention. We got a couple of sample questions that Maya's going to run. Just pick any random 2 of those, Maya, and we'll see how folks do.
All right. For this first one here, the question is, what is the best way for a manager to transmit information to all employees? The options are tell your mom, send a memorandum, have a face-to-face meeting, or put a notice on the plant's website. All right, closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. The results are 88% said have a face-to-face meeting, 9% said send a memorandum, 2% said put a notice on the plant's website, and 1% said tell your mom.
Okay, I'm going to assume that the 1% is somebody just being a smartass. But, you know, again, just to point out the comment I made earlier, 3 of those at least were reasonably right answers, but the one that 88% of you got is the best option of those. So, you know, good on you. let's run another one, and then we'll put up contact information and open the floor for questions.
All right. Next question is, which of the following is not a measure of volume? The options are cubic feet, cubic meters, gallons, or square inches. All right, closing the poll in 3, 2, and 1. The results are 93% said square inches, 4% said gallons, and 2% said cubic meters.
All right, so 93% of you guys got that right. Again, pay attention to the wording of the question. Which of these is not a measure? This was one of those, one of these things is not like the other ones. One of these things is not the same questions. So, if you focus on the wording of the question, again, I think a lot of times you'll be able to logic your way to the right answer, even if you're not really sure. So with that, we got about 6 minutes left. The floor is open for questions if anyone has any. As I indicated before, if you are potentially interested in seeing whether a copy of those those Sacramento State wastewater training manuals could go into a nearby library, I would ask you to check with your library first to make sure that they don't already have a copy. But if that's something you're interested in, you can throw your email into the chat or ask for that in the follow-up response email that you'll get, or at the end of this. I believe there's a little questionnaire that comes out, or you could email me directly. It's fine. I'm on the bottom of that list there, James. You can feel free to reach out to me. Rose and AJ are two other employees here at the Southwest EFC that you'll be introduced to later on in the series. As I said, AJ is a level 4 operator. He's going to be focusing on a lot of the more technical aspects of wastewater treatment, and Rose, who has a background in biology and water resource management, is going to be focusing largely on the math-related portions of our series, making sure that you're comfortable with the various wastewater math topics that you're liable to run into during the exam. So with that, as I said, the floor is open. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to type them in. If we don't get any questions in the next minute or so, I'll give you a couple of minutes of your day back. But like I said, reach out if you've got any questions. You can always reach out, and contact us as well, off-site or off training here. And thanks for joining us. We hope you come to some of the later, more substantive parts of the training series. They're going to be happening, I think, about every week or 2 weeks as they go out, and there'll be information available about those on our website and in our email links that come out.
I do have a couple comments and questions here for you, James. The first one's just a little question. Do licensed PEs have to take the same certification test?
My understanding is yes. Even if you're a PE, if you wanted to be an operator, and typically you have to be working at a utility to even take the exam. It's not something that you can just sort of take offhand. So if you are a PE and you want to get certified, those are two different things that are run by two different organizations. Check with your specific state. Like I said, there are some variations on the themes. Your specific state may be one that allows that, but typically the answer is no, you would have to take the actual exam.
Great, thank you. And then one more. Where can we obtain old ABC or PSI grade 4A tests?
That is a really good question. I would reach out to ABC themselves. I think there's a little bit problematic because if I remember correctly, ABC has gone to a completely computerized format. But I would start with checking with the testing agencies themselves. And step 2 would be to check with your state regulatory agency to see what they have.
All right, thank you. I don't believe I see any other questions here at the moment, but feel free to send those in. I want to thank you, James, so much for sharing your expertise with us today. For everyone out there in the audience following this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following the webinar, so you can let us know on your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on topics important to you. Thank you all again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events.
All right, thanks everybody.